This photo was taken on May 14, 2025, less than a month before Israel attacked Iran. And in the light of the open conflict between the two countries, this photo appears to be very significant. We see in it Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, US President Donald Trump, and Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara, who is better known by the name Abu Mohammed al-Jolani. He was the one who led Syria's Al-Qaeda branch and until recently appeared on the US wanted terrorist list, with the US offering $10 million for information about him. Was this meeting another domino that just a month later would lead to Israel's massive attack on Iran and war between two arch-enemies? Much suggests so. Trump not only met and shook hands with Jolani, but also announced the lifting of US sanctions imposed on Syria. This presidential decision was a shock, especially for one US ally in the region, namely Israel. Normalizing relations with Damascus called into question Netanyahu's months-long efforts to transform southern Syria into an Israeli protectorate. The discord that arose over Syria between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu shouldn't be surprising, however. This isn't an isolated case, but rather part of a broader crisis currently affecting Trump-Netanyahu relations. Although both leaders publicly emphasize there is no bad blood between them, unofficially from Trump's circle of associates, one can hear that the president is increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu's adventurous policies and views him as the main brake on his Middle Eastern plans. There are many points of contention, starting with the prolonged war in the Gaza Strip, through the issue of normalizing relations with Syria and bombing Yemen, to negotiations regarding a new nuclear agreement with Iran, and now Israel's war with that country. In each of these topics, Trump makes decisions independently, not only failing to consider Israeli interests, but not even consulting his decisions with Tel Aviv. Netanyahu, who had placed enormous hopes in Donald Trump's return to the White House for a second term, is now learning firsthand that the America First slogan applies to Israel as well. The dynamics of the dispute between Trump and Netanyahu is best illustrated by the Iran issue. Netanyahu counted on convincing Trump to join an attack targeting Iran's nuclear program. However, the American president chose talks with Tehran, while irritated Netanyahu proceeded to implement Plan B. As early as May, American intelligence detected that Israel was preparing for an unilateral strike on Iran, even without Washington's consent. Trump then reprimanded Netanyahu and warned him not to do anything that could threaten the ongoing talks with Iran. Netanyahu listened, but a month later went ahead anyway, launching an intensive bombing campaign against Iran. President Trump now maintains that Israel's actions were fully coordinated with him. However, it is hard not to get the impression that Netanyahu presented Trump with a fait accompli, taking advantage of the deadlock that had emerged in US-Iran negotiations. Netanyahu not only attacked Iran, but de facto sunk Trump's talks with Tehran, destroying 4 months of the American president's work. The Iranians have already withdrawn from the next round of talks with Trump, and given the scale of the Israeli strike, Netanyahu may have closed the door to diplomacy with Iran for good. It is hard to imagine how Iran could trust Trump again in the current situation. But that's not all. Netanyahu is pressuring Trump for American forces to join the attack on Iran, because the Israeli Prime Minister's ultimate goal appears to be overthrowing the Islamic Republic's government. For now, Trump says a firm no, seeing in Netanyahu's pressure an attempt to drag the United States into another endless Middle Eastern war, and more people from the so-called MAGA environment are questioning the limits of American support for Israel. Are we witnessing the crumbling of the foundations of the unshakable US-Israel alliance before our eyes? How deep can the Trump-Netanyahu rift go? Could the fundamentally different visions these two leaders hold for the Middle Eastern power dynamics have been the decisive catalyst that ignited the Israeli-Iranian war. Welcome to the 20s Report. The growing rift between Trump and Netanyahu signals a fundamental shift in US-Israel relations, creating significant market volatility and affecting defense stocks, energy prices, and regional investments. As traditional alliances face strain, investors must navigate increasingly complex geopolitical dynamics. In times of diplomatic uncertainty and shifting regional power balances, having the right financial tools becomes essential. XTB Investing app, partner of this episode, provides you with instruments to navigate these unpredictable market conditions. XTB investment plans allow you to regularly invest even small amounts in over 1,000 diversified ETFs, including those focused on defense, energy, and Middle Eastern markets. You can also invest in shares of thousands of companies from around the world, with both ETFs and stocks available commission-free up to 100,000 euros turnover per month. By opening an account with XTB, you will gain access to educational materials and market analysis to help you understand how geopolitical events impact investment opportunities. Check out XTB's offer by clicking the link in the description. By doing so, you are supporting this channel. Remember that investing involves risk. Several hours after the first wave of Israeli attacks on Iran, we prepared the first report for you that focused on current events and attack details. In this current material, we focus on the broader picture, particularly on the changing balance of power in the Middle East, whose dynamics have significantly accelerated in recent months. And the driving force behind this change was none other than Donald Trump. But before we proceed with that, let's note that after Friday's attack, subsequent days brought direct exchanges of fire between the sides. Israel continues its airstrike campaign, while the Islamic Republic of Iran has engaged perhaps its only effective instrument of retaliation: ballistic missiles. As of Monday morning, it is estimated that Iran, as part of Operation True Promise Free, had fired approximately 250 to 300 various types of ballistic missiles, including prototypes like the High Qasem. Starting with Iran, the Iranian Ministry of Health estimates that approximately 230 people died as a result of the attacks, with 1,200 wounded. The casualty list among Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Command has also lengthened. Those reportedly killed include Davud Shikhan, commander of Air Defense Forces, Amir Ali Hayzadeh, commander of Aerospace Forces, Esmail Khani, commander of Quds Force, and Mohammad Kazemi, head of Iranian intelligence, as well as additional nuclear program scientists. The map of targeted sites has also significantly expanded. In addition to nuclear facilities in Natanz, Isfahan, and Arak, the complex in Fordo was also bombed. Moreover, the IDF attacked military installations, including Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps headquarters in Tehran, military airports in Tabriz and Hamadan, ballistic missile bases in Kermanshah, Amman, Bit Ganeh, and Khomeini, radars in Sobashi, Kots Gadir, and ammunition depots in Kermanshah and Zanjan. Additionally, subsequent waves of attacks targeted energy and civilian industry. Hit were South Pars gas fields, where explosions and fires occurred, Fire Ejam refinery, fuel depots around Tehran, Shahran and Shahrei, as well as the Farda Motors factory in Burujerd, where extensive damage is reported. In addition to this, there were numerous strikes in Tehran. In the Noboniyat district, a 14-story building collapsed as a result of an attack, killing 60 people. Ayatollah Khamenei promised bloody retaliation, and although Iran's capabilities are limited, the fact is that the Jewish state also found itself under fire. The saturation missile attack was mostly neutralized by Israeli or allied air defense, particularly Arrow 2 and 3 systems, as well as THAAD, American system. The IDF estimates intercepting 90% of the 250 Iranian missiles and drones. This means that 20 to 30 missiles hit their targets. Among the targeted sites, Israelis report including Hakiria, IDF main command in Kiryat, a sort of Israel's Pentagon, Bazan refinery in Haifa, Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, while the US embassy in Tel Aviv was damaged by shrapnel. Additionally, there were numerous strikes on civilian and residential buildings, including in Bat Yam, where 9 people reportedly died and 200 were wounded. All of this is the result of a situation where diplomacy fails, and one or both sides reached the conclusion that the only way to resolve the impasse is through brutal force. Let's go back in time a bit and try to understand the broader dynamics behind current events. During his first term, Donald Trump pursued an extremely pro-Israeli and anti-Iranian policy. It was then that Trump officially recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and proposed a peace plan for Palestine that involved legalizing a large portion of illegal Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank. Trump also brought about the so-called Abraham Accords, through which Israel established official diplomatic relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Trump also worked intensively to get the main Arab player in the region, Saudi Arabia, to join these agreements. On Iran, Trump was equally active. In 2018, he withdrew from the nuclear agreement, JCPOA, that his predecessor, Barack Obama, had concluded with Iran. Trump also launched a, quote, maximum pressure campaign, imposing sanctions on the most sectors of the Iranian economy. In 2020, Trump nearly led to war with Iran when he ordered the killing of General Soleimani. No wonder then that after 4 years of disputes with Joe Biden, Prime Minister Netanyahu eagerly awaited Donald Trump's grand return for a second term and pinned enormous hopes on him for realizing his controversial ideas about the future of Gaza or creating an Israeli protectorate in southern Syria. Netanyahu's greatest expectations, however, were directed toward Iran, seeing here a chance to finish the game with the Islamic Republic. Although Trump, during his first term, dealt many heavy blows to the Iranians, especially economically, he wasn't able to break their resistance and force concessions. Trump's return to power appeared to Netanyahu not only as a return to maximum pressure policy, but above all as an opportunity to convince Trump to make more radical decisions this time. Or to put it bluntly, to carry out a joint American-Israeli attack on Iran's nuclear program. The first decisions Trump made after returning to the White House could indeed suggest that all of Netanyahu's dreams would come true, and that Trump would again pursue Israel-friendly policies for the next 4 years. On February 4th, Netanyahu met with Trump, becoming the first foreign leader that the new US president hosted in the Oval Office. During their joint press conference, Trump even proposed relocating Palestinians from Gaza. Even Netanyahu himself was surprised, calling Trump the greatest friend Israel has ever had in the White House. A joint American-Israeli strike targeting Iran also seemed to be only a matter of time. On the same day Trump hosted Netanyahu in Washington, the president announced the return of maximum pressure policy and ordered government agencies to activate the sanctions system targeting Iran. In the following weeks, 2 carrier strike groups were directed to the Middle East, and additional B-2 strategic bombers capable of carrying GBU-57 bombs, designed to destroy underground bunkers, landed at Diego Garcia base. In mid-March, Trump sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader. Its contents aren't known, but according to Axios, it reportedly contained threats of carrying out an attack on Iran. Meanwhile, Trump also ordered the launch of Operation Rough Rider, a campaign of intensive bombing of northern Yemen, controlled by the pro-Iranian Ansar Allah. However, if Netanyahu trusted Trump and believed in the reality of his threats against Iran, he was gravely mistaken. It quickly became apparent that for Trump, threats were just tools, pressure instruments meant to force the Iranians to sit at the negotiating table. Netanyahu learned about Trump's true intentions in the worst possible way. In early April, when Netanyahu arrived in Washington for the second time, Trump, during a joint media appearance, announced that Iran had agreed to talks and that they would soon begin in Oman. The Israeli Prime Minister was given only 24-hour notice of Trump's decision, probably due to fears that he would try to sabotage the talks with Tehran. The issue of negotiations with Iran became the first major bone of contention between Trump and Netanyahu. This concerns not only the very fact of undertaking talks with Iran, but also the negotiating position adopted by American diplomats, led by Steve Witkoff, who heads not only the Ukraine-Russia peace talks, but also the Iranian portfolio. To the surprise of Israeli commentators, the US-Iran talks are devoted almost exclusively to the issue of Iran's nuclear program. Other contentious issues, such as Tehran's support for pro-Iranian formations operating in the Middle East, axis of resistance, or Iran's ballistic missile program, are also being discussed, but Americans don't treat them as priorities or necessary conditions for a future agreement. Such an approach may be surprising, because it contradicts Trump's stance during his first term. In 2018, Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, criticizing the agreement for incorrectly focusing solely on Iran's nuclear program, while ignoring ballistic missile issues and pro-Iranian formations operating in the region. Trump claimed then that failing to regulate all these issues in one agreement was a cardinal error. Now, after 7 years, Trump has abandoned his maximalist demands and is ready to accept an agreement that would regulate only Iran's nuclear program. This attitude by Trump is caused by Iranian stubbornness. They have constantly refused any talks regarding their ballistic missile program and support for the axis of resistance since 2018. We have thus reached a rather bizarre situation, where Trump first withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, promising a better deal, and now, after 7 years, is essentially negotiating the reactivation of the old, bad agreement from Obama's time. However, this isn't the only thing irritating Prime Minister Netanyahu's pro-war camp. Another point of contention is how Trump wants to regulate Iran's nuclear program itself. Israel advocates for the so-called Libyan scenario, complete and permanent elimination of Iran's nuclear program. In this scenario, Tehran couldn't even have a civilian nuclear program. President Trump, however, has a different vision. What is most important to him is that Iran doesn't construct atomic weapons. At the same time, Trump is open to the issue of a civilian nuclear program. The big unknown remains the topic of uranium enrichment by Iran. Axios, which obtained details of the offer Iranians received from Trump, claims Americans agreed to uranium enrichment by Iran. After these leaks were published, Trump, who had previously dodged this topic, stated he wouldn't allow for it. American diplomats participating in the talks, however, unofficially admit that uranium enrichment isn't yet decided, and a compromise is possible here, perhaps in the form of a regional consortium that would oversee Iran's uranium enrichment. It is worth noting that at the end of May, the White House issued a new directive to government agencies, calling for a pause in imposing new sanctions on Iran, which is another manifestation of the Trump administration's conciliatory approach toward Iran. Israeli frustration caused by such a turn of events is enormous and continues to grow. Prime Minister Netanyahu, commenting on the US-Iran talks, stated bluntly, "A bad deal is worse than no deal at all." From Netanyahu's perspective, a US agreement with Iran could be even more dangerous than its absence. Lifting sanctions on Iran and the influx of foreign investors is a direct path to strengthening both the Islamic Republic's internal situation and its position on the international stage. This is equally, if not more, dangerous than an Iranian atomic bomb. We will return to the Iran issue, but first we must discuss several other points of contention that exist between Trump and Netanyahu. The dispute over Iran alone doesn't explain the Israeli Prime Minister's rebellious stance. On May 4th, ballistic missiles fired by Yemeni Houthis fell near Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. 8 people were injured, and flights at Israel's most important airport were temporarily suspended. This is yet another such attack since October 2023, when Yemeni Houthis sided with Hamas and announced that as long as fighting in Gaza doesn't end, they will, in a gesture of solidarity with Palestinians, shell Israel and attack Israel-linked commercial ships trying to pass through the strategic Bab al-Mandab Strait, through which about 12% of global trade passes annually. 2 days after the attack on Ben Gurion Airport, President Trump announced he had reached a ceasefire agreement with the Houthis. The Yemenis agreed to immediately halt attacks on commercial ships passing through the Bab al-Mandab Strait, and in exchange, Trump ordered the end of Operation Rough Rider, under which Americans had been bombing northern Yemen. The Israeli government wasn't warned about the upcoming agreement with the Houthis at all. Trump's decision left Israelis both stunned and angry. It quickly became apparent that the agreement the US president reached with the Houthis doesn't cover Israel in any way. The Houthis can continue their attacks targeting Israel without fearing American retaliation. Accusations appeared in Israel that Trump had abandoned his allies, or even that this constituted betrayal. But that's not all. A few days later, Trump dealt Prime Minister Netanyahu an even more painful blow. On May 13th, Donald Trump landed in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which was the first stop of his 4-day Middle East visit, during which he was also to visit Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. It was during this visit to Saudi Arabia that the photograph we presented at the beginning of this video was taken. Thanks to the efforts of Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Trump not only agreed to meet with Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shara, but also agreed to normalize diplomatic relations and lift the painful economic sanctions from Syria that had been blocking the country's reconstruction. This decision also wasn't consulted with the Israelis, and its consequences called into question the grand plans Prime Minister Netanyahu had tied to southern Syria. In December 2024, right after Assad's fall, Netanyahu ordered the launch of Operation Bashan Arrow, under which Israeli aviation destroyed most of the heavy equipment left from Assad's army, and ground forces entered several dozen kilometers into Syrian territory. The goal of Operation Bashan Arrow is to create an Israeli buffer zone in southern Syria that would stretch from the occupied Golan Heights in the west to the Druze province of Suwaida in the east. Israel wants to create this buffer zone based on Syrian Druze, who live in concentrated communities in the south of the country, while simultaneously not yet having reached a final agreement with the new government in Damascus. Trump's decision questioned the sense of continuing Operation Bashan Arrow. However, knowing Prime Minister Netanyahu's character, it is doubtful he would decide to withdraw Israeli troops from Syria. The Prime Minister's stubbornness could have far-reaching consequences and further deepen the Trump-Netanyahu dispute. The government in Damascus has the support of both Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which will certainly lobby Washington for the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Syria, presenting Netanyahu as an aggressor and schemer trying to undermine the agreement Trump worked out with Damascus. Such lobbying, especially from the Saudis, could realistically harm Netanyahu. In recent months, Trump has clearly prioritized good relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The best background for understanding the nature of the dispute that has emerged between Israel's Prime Minister and the US President is the aforementioned visit by the American President to the Middle East. Donald Trump sees himself as a visionary and at the same time a businessman. Trump seeks big deals that would, on one hand, showcase his negotiating prowess, and on the other hand, bring significant financial benefits to the United States. Stephen Cook, a Middle East expert from the Council on Foreign Relations, put it well, quote, "It is important to recognize that the president's approach to foreign policy is heavily influenced by his vision of economic statecraft. This is evident not only in the Middle Eastern theater, but also in negotiations with Russia, where Trump is strongly influenced by economic arguments regarding both American control over Ukrainian minerals and the benefits American investors could derive from economic cooperation with Moscow." Donald Trump's vision for the Middle East is also based on economic interests. During his second term, Trump would therefore like to negotiate an agreement with Iran, even if it meant returning to Obama-era agreements, further expand the Abraham Accords, and deepen continued economic cooperation with the wealthy Gulf states. Implementing each of these projects would mean significant profits for American investors. Only from this perspective can we understand the reasons for the deepening discord between Trump and Netanyahu when looking at recent months' events. In Trump's eyes, Netanyahu has become the main brake who constantly, in one way or another, sabotages the implementation of the grand Middle Eastern projects Trump wants to realize. For instance, in Trump's view, Netanyahu bears responsibility for the lack of expansion of the Abraham Accords. The Arabs don't want to agree to join the Accords as long as Israel doesn't end the war in Gaza. However, Netanyahu's stubbornness is enormous, and he is determined to prolong the war even if completely eliminating Hamas is just a mirage. The wealthy Gulf states present a completely different approach to Trump, better understanding the transactional nature of the American president. For example, US normalization with Syria had its price, which the Saudis paid, the main sponsors of the Trump-Shara meeting. The price was the Saudis signing contracts worth $283 billion during Trump's visit and promising to invest a total of $600 in the US over the next 4 years. The Saudis aren't an exception here. Each of the 3 Arab countries Trump visited during his Middle East trip promised to invest astronomical sums in the American economy. The Qataris signed contracts for $243 billion and the Emiratis for about $200 billion, promising to invest as much as $1.4 billion in the US over the next 10 years. The issue of Israel and the Persian Gulf in Trump's foreign policy remains interconnected. While Netanyahu remains in Trump's eyes the main brake on his Middle Eastern ideas, the wealthy Gulf monarchies are emerging as the new regional champions. This has real consequences for the regional puzzle, as seen in American-Saudi talks regarding the nuclear program. According to Reuters, President Trump has stopped making nuclear cooperation with the Saudis conditional on Saudi Arabia first establishing diplomatic relations with Israel. This isn't so much a concession from Trump, as it is a manifestation of the president prioritizing relations with the Saudis at Israel's expense. And so while the US-Israel alliance is still stable, the effects of growing tension in these relations could be serious and difficult to overestimate. This is especially true since Prime Minister Netanyahu continues to operate under pressure from his ultra-right coalition partners, whose votes are essential for him to remain in the Prime Minister's seat. How dangerous this situation is can best be seen in the events of the recent days and Israel's attack on Iran. Here too we can clearly see the rift between Netanyahu and Trump, and that both leaders are not playing on the same team at all. On Monday, June 9th, the Iranians rejected the draft nuclear agreement presented by American diplomats. Although talks were not broken off, even President Trump himself admitted that he increasingly doubts the possibility of reaching an agreement. Israel decided to exploit the stalemate in talks with Iran and began preparations for a strike. However, this time, Unlike a month earlier, Trump didn't call Netanyahu with a reprimand. Instead, Trump decided to use the threat of an Israeli operation for his own purposes, namely to soften Tehran's position before the next round of talks scheduled for Sunday, June 15th. Trump assumed he would outplay both Iran and Israel. The threat of an Israeli attack was supposed to force the Iranians into concessions, while the adventurous Netanyahu would never actually carry out his attack plans. Just hours before the start of Operation Rising Lion, Trump told the Israelis to hold off on the strike. Ultimately, however, Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, outmaneuvered his American ally and ordered the bombing of Iran to begin on Thursday, June 12, 3 days before the next round of US-Iran talks. The Israeli attack destroyed 4 months of work by President Trump's administration. The Iranians withdrew from talks in Oman, and it is unclear if talks will be resumed at all. Given the scale of the Israeli attack, which decapitated the supreme command of Iranian armed forces, the doors to diplomacy may have closed permanently. Although Trump won't admit it, the Israeli attack is a slap in the face for the American president, who over recent months made it clear he wanted to reach an agreement with Iran while avoiding open conflict. Netanyahu's perspective, however, is diametrically different. For him, sinking US-Iran talks is a huge success. Lifting sanctions and opening the Iranian economy to foreign capital is a fast track to strengthening the Islamic Republic's position, both internally and on the international stage. In Netanyahu's eyes, this is much more dangerous than an Iranian bomb. However, a unilateral strike on Iran is not the pinnacle of Prime Minister Netanyahu's political ambitions, who is now trying to convince Americans to join the attack. The argument meant to persuade the US is the fact that Israel, without American help, won't be able to destroy parts of Iranian nuclear facilities that are located deep underground, like the Uranium Enrichment Center in Fordow. Israel lacks specialized equipment for destroying underground facilities, such as GBU-57, American bunker-busting penetrating bombs. Some commentators believe that this is another game by Netanyahu, who, with arguments about the necessity of American support, is trying to entangle the United States in another endless Middle Eastern war, and his true goal is eliminating Iran political leadership and destroying the Islamic Republic. It is worth being aware that the current US-Israel tensions are primarily personal in nature and stem from 2 different visions of the Middle East presented by Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu with his ultra-right coalition. However, we can't lose sight of the broader problem we have highlighted in several other pieces: the generational changes occurring in American society. This will define American-Israeli relations in the coming decades. And these trends are extremely unfavorable for Israel. Pew Research Center data shows a steady increase in the percentage of Americans who have a negative opinion of Israel. In 2022, 42% of Americans had a negative view of Israel. In 2025, it's already 53%. Democrats lead here, but even among Republicans, who traditionally view Israel as a close ally, this negative trend is visible. Equally interesting are 2024 Pew Research Center studies showing how large the differences in perception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are between different age groups. While 47% of Americans aged 65 years plus sympathize more with Israelis, in the 18 to 29 age group, as many as 33% of Americans sympathize with Palestinians, and only 14% with Israelis. And this data heralds nothing short of a Copernican revolution in US-Israel relations in the coming decades. Changing social moods in the United States, particularly among younger generations, mean that unconditional support for Israel, until recently treated as a political given, is increasingly being called into question. This is a fundamental change that may eventually translate into political, budgetary, and even military decisions. And perhaps it is precisely in these trends that we should seek the source of today's intransigence among Israeli leaders. They know that time is working against them. Despite growing international pressure, tensions in relations with the US, and increasing costs of conducting military operations, they remain determined to continue the war in Gaza and push their vision of regional order. This may be Israel's last window of strategic opportunity, the last moment when Israel can try to rebuild the Middle East on its own terms. Before global alliances change, the balance of power shifts, and above all, the priorities of its greatest ally. From this perspective, the current war ceases to be merely a conflict over Gaza. It becomes a battle for the future of Israel's position in a world that increasingly no longer resembles the one in which Israel emerged as a regional power. All of this somewhat explains why Israel decided on such drastic measures. For Netanyahu and all of Israel, this could have been the last call to solve the Iranian question once and for all. American support is weakening, but they still stand by Israel. And this is a much better position for an attack than one where they would be completely neutral or even punish Israel for adventurous policies. Whether such a strategy will pay off for the Israelis, we will only be able to assess in some time. For now, the IDF is essentially carrying out an execution of the Islamic Republic, though without American capabilities, they are unable to do so in an absolute manner. What is known for now is one thing. Netanyahu is not for the first time operating on the assumption that, in the Middle East, the best defense strategy is offense.